studying editing, writing, and media and at Florida State University. And the research interests are critical and queer theories, specifically the historicizing of modern conceptualizations of queer identities and language.
Thank you so much. Before I start, there's like a whopping trigger warning for this whole paper. We're going to be talking about domestic violence, specifically within the lesbian community. So I just want to put that on the table so you guys understand that. So, in order to uncover the circumstances which led to Carmen Maria Machado's memoir, In the Dream House, a survey of the literary, personal, and legal writings regarding lesbian domestic violence provides a greater scope of understanding. This paper argues that the closeting of lesbian abuse is injurious to the community, facilitated by the imposed silence of survivors, which creates the second closet, ultimately protecting the abusers. While there is a plethora of implications to consider for terms such as lesbian, domestic violence, heterosexism, and heterorelationism, the expansive texts and authors which concern themselves is not entirely considered within the scope of the paper. There's just so much. This is a fraction of what has been made available, which has increased dramatically since the turn of the 21st century, and is specifically concerned with early landmark cases, the writing of lesbian feminists who were primarily active between 1970 and 1990, and how these initial writings framed the reality which Machado faced, despite the decades between her abuse and the initial writings which began to dismantle the obfuscation and isolation of lesbian survivors of abuse. In the Dream House describes the abusive relationship between Machado and her abuser, referred to only as the woman in the dream house throughout the text. The memoir simultaneously breaks generic conventions and imposed historic silencings of lesbians and lesbian survivors of battering and abuse. Although this was not Machado's first lesbian relationship, it was one of her first long-term relationships, and the first where she felt desired. Love bombing is a powerful drug. This positionality of newness and inexperience provides abusers a specific opportunity, one that is repeated throughout many iterations of writing and court documents discussed in this survey. Due to her relative inexperience and the geographic isolation from her family, coupled with her closeting to some of the more conservative members of her extended family, Machado was left to her own devices to reckon with the reality and the aftermath of her abuse. Rather than a linear narrative, Machado uses a fragmented style of writing, specifically choosing to write in vignettes, jumping between first person during her theoretical, contextual, and the greater discussion of the LGBTQ+ community, and second person, when retelling moments within the relationship and abuse. In part, this is rationalized by the fragmentation of self and thought processes incurred by abuse and the following CPTSD. It provides a tangible understanding of disconnection and depersonalization when trying to unravel contradictory actions, experiences, and conversations between an abuser and a survivor. More often than not, the survivor, specifically within the lesbian community, does not believe they are being abused or battered. While this phenomena is not individual to lesbian communities, as the disbelief that harm is being done by the person you love is not unique to lesbians, however, due to the separation between abuse and heterosexual relationships, which we can also recognize as a heterosexist negotiation of the term abuse, which describes abuse as male violence toward a female victim, and the possibility of abuse in a non-normative relationship. Acknowledging the experience of abuse confronts with ideas of separation between the patriarchy and lesbian relationships and the greater community. Earlier iterations of lesbian communities resisted the implication that abuse could have existed outside of the patriarchy's reach, as a woman-loving woman community should do just that. Remove itself from the harmful impositions of violence, which they identified as inherently tied to masculinity and heterosexual relationships. Carrie Lobel compiled and edited lesbian feminist essays centering battering and abuse in the 1993 text naming the violence, speaking out about lesbian battering. Activists, lawyers, and lesbian feminists, or combinations of all three, wrote personal and academic essays concerning the relevance of battery and abuse in the lesbian community, which complicates the acknowledgement of these occurrences and how the community may, what complicates the acknowledgements of these occurrences and how the community may move forward. This is one of the earliest texts available where lesbian battering and abuse is even considered a possibility, and the collection of writing demonstrated just how pervasive of a reality it was. Donna J. Cesare, a lesbian feminist and survivor of abuse, wrote The Second Closet Battered Lesbians, which is alluded to in the title of this paper. Cesare approaches her essay first by framing it as such, quote, "Though a lesbian feminist activist for years, I still thought of battering as, first, a male against female act, and second, as being a physically violent act," end quote. She was not alone in this belief, as it was influenced by the lesbian community as a whole and reified in the legal description of abuse. Legally, it was not possible for a woman to abuse anyone, and the imposition of the law outside of the lesbian community only perpetuated the implication that it was not possible. Socially, women were not powerful enough to enact abusive violence. Within lesbian circles, the positionality away from men and the patriarchy deemed it seemingly impossible for abuse to exist between two women. Furthermore, the general acceptance of abuse, if in the chance that it was acknowledged, was limited to physical violence. The impact of emotional and financial abuse was outside of the realm of possibility in both legal and lesbian discourses. Cesare provides a personal account of the minimal pool of resources for battered and/or abused lesbians, and the way in which many abusers were woven into the very fabric of these resources. Her abuser's ex sought out and was turned away from a shelter that their shared abuser would eventually work at as a relief counselor during Cesare's abuse. There is little to no accountability for abusers, which Russo wrote about in 2001 and will discuss shortly, which continue to facilitate the silencing of survivors, reifying the closet in which they hid the truth of the abuse and which protected the abuser. This closet is amplified by the, quote, powerful forces at work called shame and denial. There's also the additional pressure caused by a community which has, up until recently, buried its collective head in the sand, end quote. Cesare ends with a call to extend the then current discourse surrounding lesbian battering and abuse to begin to include the mere possibility that this exists within the lesbian community and to let survivors relinquish their silence and come out of this second closet. Anne Russo, author of Taking Back Our Lives, A Call to Action for Feminist Movement, dissects the discrepancy between resources and legal discourse in Deborah Reed's court case and the prevalence of heterosexism and heterorelationality regarding lesbian domestic violence on a larger scale. Reed was the only Black lesbian in a group of 8 women convicted for the deaths of their abusers, and the only one who remained in prison after the Framingham 8 submitted petitions for their wrongful imprisonments and the court's oversight of battered women's syndrome, a psychological state which references an action of self-defense against one's abuser, which results in their death, and which typically absolves a survivor from imprisonment based on the history of abuse. Russo interviewed Reed after the decision regarding the Framingham 8 was finalized, and Reed was facing the entirety of her 9 to 14-year sentence for manslaughter, despite the clemency granted to the other 7 heterosexual white women. Not only was the law against lesbian abuse, it and the puny resources provided to LGBTQ+ survivors were not extended beyond white middle-class women. Reed was inherently fighting an uphill battle, and that was before the court refused any proof of her 5-year-long relationship with and the simultaneous period abuse at the hands of Jacqueline Gary. One aspect of this case, along with Cesare's and even Annette Green, who we'll get to, she was the first lesbian who attempted to use battered women's syndrome in her trial for shooting her abuser on Halloween of 1989, is, again, the silencing and disbelief directed toward lesbians. Every author in this survey addresses a common theme in their abuse. They were new to the lesbian community, isolated from their friends and family either by space or prejudice, and did not believe that abuse could even be applicable to their relationships due to the belief that women are intrinsically separate from the possibility of such violence. Oftentimes, the abuser can situate the abuse as a simple fact of lesbian experience, specifically when the abuse does not cross the line into physical violence and when the abusive relationship is the survivor's first foray into lesbian relationships. In other situations, the heterosexist assumption of abuse are feasible and resisted. If the more masculine lesbian enacts the abuse, the feminine-leaning lesbian often felt that an unjust conflation with manliness was to blame for the violence, not the control and power that the abuser was seeking and extorting. To further these situations, there is the pressure of perfection in any minority group, and the lesbian community is not exempt from this expectation from the dominant social group. Returning to In the Dream House, Machado discusses this phenomenon in Dream House as queer villainy. The historical inclusion of LGBTQ+ characters has been restricted to villains, a trope which began in the 1980s as a means of attempting to dissuade viewers from choosing the queer lifestyle and effectively refusing the possibility that queer characters and individuals may, perhaps, be good. And this is heavily contested in modernity. The recent focus on proving that queer individuals are indeed good has begun to obfuscate the chance that queerness is multifaceted, which is Machado's primary concern in this section. She posits that in refusing this villainy, writers and audiences refuse the humanity of the characters, which is then extended to queer reality. In order to be fully recognized within the scope of humanity, the good and the bad are imperative. Refusing the bad potentialities of the queer community serves as a means of becoming more palatable. Individuals are an amalgamation of many parts, and to actionably dissect issues within a community, these parts must be held together. Forcing the bad further into the closet serves no one but those who extort power for personal gain. This recognition would implicate the possibility of lesbian battering and abuse and would support the destruction of the second closet. Furthermore, identifying queerness as separate from heterosexuality, which is not as immediately as distinct as one might assume, gives those within the lesbian community and operating from legal spaces the ability to more accurately examine the situations and histories surrounding the survivor who courageously stepped out of the second closet. The court's denial of Deborah Reed's evidence of both relationship and abuse would not have resulted in the decision that Reed and Gary were in a mutually abusive relationship, the decision which resulted in Reed's continued imprisonment. If Reed, or Cesare, or Machado were given information and visibility regarding the possibility and support available to them as survivors of abuse, perhaps the second closet would be more easily dismantled. In 1990, before any of the texts mentioned thus far were written, 1 year after Annette Green was imprisoned for shooting her abuser on Halloween and only 4 years after Machado was born, Ruthann Lobel published Lavender Bruises, Intra-Lesbian Violence, Law, and Lesbian Legal Theory. The article, published in Golden Gate University Law Review, examines the intersection of feminist legal theory, the newly developed lesbian legal theory, and the implications of heterosexism and heterorelationality in cases concerning lesbian domestic violence. Lobel provides a concise overview of the workings of each legal theory and how neither fully addressed the issues which the legal action regarding lesbian domestic violence presented to survivors. The abuser was consistently privileged and absolved. At the time, lesbian identities were not so much as recognized within the courts. Reed's case serves as proof that this issue persisted in the following years, and the lack of recognition works seamlessly alongside the legal definition of abuse to obfuscate lesbians who either killed their abuser in self-defense or attempted to take legal action against their abuser for their safety, commonly through restraining orders. Lobel critically inspects the existing legal theories which were utilized in cases including and similar to Annette Green's. Green was a mother in West Palm Beach who lived with her 14-year-old twins and abuser. After enduring Yvonne Julio's abuse for 10 years, Green shot and killed Julio on October 31st, 1989. Her case was the first to attempt claiming battered women's syndrome in relation to a lesbian. Ultimately, the court rejected the claim and sentenced Green to a maximum 17-year sentence, which is more forgiving than the death penalty she might have faced had they convicted her of first-degree murder, which they tried to do. This case seemingly set the precedent for lesbian relationships to be lessened in gravity. The court ignored the history of abuse and isolation which occurred over the decade-long relationship. Unsure if the spousal battered women's syndrome could apply in such a relationship, insisted that Green intentionally and even explicitly planned Julio's death, and the jury ultimately decided that, quote, she killed Julio out of hatred, ill will, or spite in the heat of the moment, end quote. In this case, and similar cases, Lobel asserts that lesbianism is distorted, misrecognized, ignored entirely, or forced into heterorelationality, where one individual must perceivably play the gender roles ascribed to men, while the other fulfills the gender roles of women. Not only does this reinforce harmful stereotypes, but it maintains a framing of heterorelationality and upholds heterosexist institutions. By framing lesbian and other queer relationships with the expectations and norms of heterosexual relationships, the intricacies of cases like Reed's and Green's are negligible in the eyes of the court, which was implicitly more harmful before Obergefell v. Hodges, which made same-sex marriage legal across the United States in 2015. In states where marriage equality did not ensure equal rights to LGBTQ+ relationships, battered women's syndrome had little standing, as many courts would accept it only in relation to marital abuse. Lobel's discussion surrounding feminist and lesbian legal theory addresses why neither is sufficient in protecting survivors in the court of law, whether they are seeking protective action or are on trial for self-defense. Rousseau's interview with Deborah Reed illustrates the continuous disregard of the courts in situations of race, class, and sexuality. Cesare's recounting of her own abuse and her community's inaction to support her and others in similar situations fleshes out the pattern of communal silencing of abuse and protection granted to the abusers. Each of these women's writings demonstrate the pervasive nature of the second closet, which is implicated in every survivor's hesitancy to come forward, seek out legal action or shelter, or believe that they are truly enduring the abuser's violence. Carmen Maria Machado published in the Dream House in 2019, nearly 30 years after Lobel's article was published. While the legal regard for lesbian abuse has improved, albeit marginally, Machado describes a similar pressure to stay silent and protect the reputation of her abuser. Whether this is an underlying reason for leaving her abuser unnamed in the text is not within the scope of this study. Regardless, the woman in the dream house is described in a similar way to the others within this survey: butch, assertive, experienced, and volatile. It is the duty of the reader to resist conflating the butchness to the masculinity of male abusers. The violence is tied not to the patriarchy and one's participation in it. Instead, the violence is tied to the maintenance of control over another individual, the power high one achieves when lording over another's life. The second closet is an unfortunate phenomenon, complete with a harsh reality. The lesbian community spent decades vying for distinction from heterosexual relationships and heterosexist influences within the community. Some lesbian feminists who were active just before the publications included in this survey went to the extreme of living in off-grid communes to distance themselves from the patriarchy and masculinity as completely as possible. Separating from the patriarchy is a worthy cause, but this implies that the issue of control, which is the fulcrum around which interrelational abuse circulates, relies on toxic masculinity. In choosing to prioritize this over the truth of lesbian survivors and the very tangible reality of lesbian domestic violence, the second closet is constructed on the same frame as heteronormativity. Refusing to see it does not mean it disappears. Instead, it negates the complex humanity of lesbians through the same modes as heterosexist institutions: the police who refuse to interfere in lesbian abuse, the courts which declare that the abuse was mutual, despite ample evidence that it was an unequal power dynamic which privileged the abusers, domestic abuse shelters which previously did not allow lesbians whatsoever, and still oftentimes do not provide outright lesbian services or ascribe themselves to the same insistence that women do not participate in abusive behaviors. The interim between Lobel and Machado's writing do not show a monumentous step forward in either lesbian or legal communities. There is work to be done to destigmatize the existence of lesbian abuse and to support the survivors who deserve recognition, support, and justice.